The wind moves across the frozen landscape, carrying with it the whispers of a world that existed thousands of years ago. In this ancient time, when ice covered much of the northern hemisphere and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath beneath blankets of snow, there walked a creature of remarkable adaptation and quiet majesty. The woolly mammoth, a giant of the Ice Age, a symbol of survival in the harshest conditions imaginable. These magnificent animals roamed across vast territories, their footsteps marking the frozen ground, their presence shaping entire ecosystems. To understand the woolly mammoth is to understand an entire era of Earth's history, a time when life found ways to flourish even in the most unforgiving environments. The story of the woolly mammoth begins not in the ice and snow, but millions of years before the great glaciers advanced across the continents. The mammoth lineage traces back to Africa, where the earliest ancestors of elephants first evolved. Around 55 million years ago, in the warm forests and grasslands of that ancient continent, the first proboscideans appeared. These were not the giants we know today, but smaller creatures, some no larger than a pig, with short trunks and a different way of life entirely. Over millions of years, these animals evolved, adapted, and spread across the world, giving rise to numerous species, each suited to its own particular environment and time. The direct ancestors of the woolly mammoth emerged around 5 million years ago in Africa. These were the early members of the genus Mammothus, creatures that stood taller than their predecessors and had developed the distinctive features that would define their descendants. The steppe mammoth, Mammuthus troghantherii, was one of the key species in this evolutionary journey. Standing up to 15 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing as much as 10 tons, the steppe mammoth was among the largest elephants that ever lived. These enormous animals moved northward from Africa into Europe and Asia, following the grasslands and adapting to cooler climates as the Earth gradually entered periods of glaciation. Around 400,000 years ago, a transformation occurred. The climate was changing, becoming colder, more severe. The ice ages were beginning in earnest, and the northern regions of the world were being reshaped by advancing glaciers and dropping temperatures. In this challenging environment, some populations of steppe mammoths began to evolve traits that would help them survive the cold. Their ears became smaller, reducing heat loss. Their tails shortened, and most distinctively, they began to develop thick coats of fur, layered protection against the brutal cold of the Ice Age. These were the first true woolly mammoths, Mammuthus primigenius, a species that would come to define the Ice Age itself. The woolly mammoth was a creature of impressive physical characteristics, each adaptation serving a specific purpose in the frozen world it inhabited. An adult male mammoth could stand 11 feet tall at the shoulder, though some individuals grew even larger. They weighed between 6 and 8 tons, their massive bodies covered in a coat that was unlike anything seen in modern elephants. The outer layer consisted of long guard hairs, some reaching 3 feet in length, dark brown to reddish in colour, hanging down like a protective curtain. Beneath these guard hairs lay a dense undercoat of fine wool, providing insulation that trapped warm air close to the skin. This double-layered coat was so effective that woolly mammoths could maintain their body temperature even when the air around them dropped to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The tusks of a woolly mammoth were truly spectacular, curving outward and then inward, sometimes reaching 15 feet in length. These enormous structures were actually modified incisor teeth. Unlike the relatively straight tusks of modern elephants, mammoth tusks followed elaborate spiraling curves, and scientists believe they used these distinctive tusks in multiple ways. They cleared snow from the ground to reach vegetation beneath. They stripped bark from trees. Male mammoths used them in competitions with other males, pushing and wrestling to establish dominance. The tusks grew throughout the animal's life, adding new layers each year, and by examining cross-sections of these tusks, researchers can read the story of an individual mammoth's life, seeing patterns of growth that reveal seasons of plenty and seasons of hardship. The head of a woolly mammoth was distinctively shaped, with a high, domed skull that gave them a profile quite different from modern elephants. This dome contained spaces filled with air pockets, making the skull lighter than it would otherwise be, an important adaptation for an animal that needed to carry its head and those massive tusks through deep snow. The ears were small, much smaller than those of African or Asian elephants, typically only about a foot in length. This reduction in ear size was crucial for preventing heat loss in the cold environment. Every square inch of exposed skin represented potential heat loss, and by minimizing the surface area of their ears, woolly mammoths conserved precious body heat. The trunk of a woolly mammoth was a marvel of evolution, just as versatile and sensitive as the trunks of modern elephants. This elongated nose and upper lip contained over 40,000 individual muscles, allowing for incredibly precise movements. A mammoth could use its trunk to pluck a single blade of grass or to uproot an entire tree. The tip of the trunk had two finger-like projections, enabling the animal to grasp objects with surprising dexterity. During the harsh winters, when snow covered everything, mammoths used their trunks to detect vegetation buried beneath the white blanket, their sense of smell guiding them to food that would be invisible to the eye. The feet of these massive creatures were another remarkable adaptation to their environment. Each foot was broad and padded, spreading the animal's weight across a larger surface area, much like a natural snowshoe. The bottom of each foot had a thick pad of fatty tissue that acted as a cushion, protecting the bones above from the impact of walking on frozen ground. In the summer, when the tundra thawed and became muddy, these large feet prevented the mammoth from sinking too deeply into the soft earth. The tracks left by these feet, preserved in ancient mud that later hardened into rock, give us glimpses into their movements, their migrations, their daily journeys across the landscape. The environment that woolly mammoths inhabited was a landscape of extremes, beautiful in its own stark way, yet demanding and unforgiving. During the height of the last ice age, which reached its maximum extent around 20,000 years ago, ice sheets covered much of northern Europe, Asia, and North America. But the mammoths did not live on the ice itself. Instead, they inhabited a unique ecosystem that existed between the ice sheets and the warmer regions to the south. This was the mammoth steppe, a vast grassland unlike anything that exists today, stretching from Spain in the west to Canada in the east, a continuous band of cold, dry prairie that supported an incredible diversity of large animals. The mammoth steppe was cold, certainly, with winters that brought temperatures far below freezing and summers that were short but productive. The landscape was open, with few trees, dominated instead by grasses, sedges, and low-growing herbs. These plants were tough and hardy, adapted to the cold and to the constant grazing pressure from the herds of large herbivores that lived there. The climate was also quite dry, more like a cold desert than the wet tundra that exists in the Arctic today. This dryness was crucial because it meant that snow cover in winter was relatively thin in many areas, allowing animals to reach the vegetation beneath without expending too much energy. In this landscape, woolly mammoths were not alone. They shared their world with an extraordinary array of other Ice Age giants. Woolly rhinoceroses, covered in their own thick coats of fur, grazed alongside the mammoths. Their long horns used to sweep snow aside. Cave lions, larger than any lion alive today, prowled the edges of the herds, watching for the young, the sick, or the unwary. Giant short-faced bears, standing 12 feet tall on their hind legs, commanded respect from every other creature in the landscape. Herds of horses, smaller and stockier than modern breeds, moved across the plains in great numbers. Reindeer, musk oxen, and saiga antelope added to the diversity of herbivores, each species finding its own niche in this complex ecosystem. The daily life of a woolly mammoth was shaped by the constant need to find food. An adult mammoth required enormous amounts of vegetation to sustain its massive body, consuming perhaps 400 pounds of plant material each day. In the summer months, when the sun barely set and the tundra came alive with growth, feeding was a time of abundance. The mammoths would graze for up to 20 hours each day, moving slowly across the landscape, their trunks constantly reaching down to pull up grasses, their molars grinding the tough vegetation into a digestible pulp. The summer was a time for putting on weight, building up fat reserves that would be crucial for survival during the long winter ahead. The teeth of woolly mammoths were particularly fascinating adaptations to their diet of tough, abrasive grasses. Unlike most mammals, which replace their baby teeth with adult teeth and then stop, mammoths had a conveyor belt system of tooth replacement. They had only 4 molars active at any given time, 1 in each quarter of the mouth, but waiting behind each active molar were additional teeth, lined up and ready. As the front tooth wore down from the constant grinding of grass and grit, it would gradually move forward and eventually fall out, and the tooth behind it would move forward to take its place. A mammoth could go through 6 sets of molars in its lifetime, and when the final set wore down, usually in the animal's 60s, the mammoth could no longer feed effectively and would face starvation. Winter brought profound changes to the mammoth's world. The days grew short, with only a few hours of dim light in the far north. Temperatures plummeted, and what little vegetation remained was buried beneath snow. But the mammoths had evolved to handle these challenges. Their thick coats protected them from the cold, and their ability to detect food beneath the snow meant they could continue feeding even when the ground was covered. They would use their tusks like shovels, sweeping away the snow to expose the dried grasses beneath. In areas where snow accumulated too deeply, mammoths would migrate, moving to regions where the wind kept the ground more exposed, where feeding was easier. Social structure played an important role in mammoth survival. Like modern elephants, woolly mammoths lived in family groups led by an older female, a matriarch who held the knowledge of where to find food and water, where to shelter from the worst storms, which routes to take during seasonal migrations. These family groups typically consisted of the matriarch, her daughters, and their offspring, creating tight-knit units of related females and young. The matriarch's experience was invaluable, her memory of past seasons and past challenges guiding the family through difficult times. When she died, leadership would pass to one of her daughters, usually the eldest, ensuring that knowledge accumulated over decades was not lost. Male mammoths followed a different pattern. Young males would stay with their family group until they reached adolescence, usually around 10 to 15 years of age. At that point, they would leave, striking out on their own or joining loose associations of other males. Adult male mammoths were more solitary than females, though they would sometimes travel together in small bachelor groups. These males would seek out family groups during the mating season, competing with other males for the opportunity to mate with receptive females. The largest, strongest males, those in their prime around 40 years of age, were most successful in these competitions, ensuring that their genes were passed on to the next generation. Communication among woolly mammoths was complex and multifaceted. Like modern elephants, they almost certainly used a combination of vocalizations, body language, and chemical signals to convey information to each other. They could produce powerful low-frequency calls, sounds too deep for human ears to hear, that could travel for miles across the open steppe. These infrasonic calls allowed mammoths to stay in contact with each other, even when separated by great distances, to warn of danger, to signal their location, to coordinate movements. Higher frequency calls, trumpeting sounds, expressed excitement, alarm, or aggression. The position of the trunk, the angle of the ears, the stance of the body all conveyed meaning to other mammoths who could read these signals. The relationship between woolly mammoths and early humans is one of the most fascinating aspects of mammoth history. Humans and mammoths coexisted for thousands of years, and this coexistence shaped both species in profound ways. The first encounters between humans and mammoths occurred in Africa and Eurasia, where early human ancestors would have seen mammoths as they migrated through these regions. But it was in Europe and northern Asia, during the height of the Ice Age, that the relationship became most significant. Here, human populations known as Neanderthals and later modern humans lived in close proximity to mammoth herds, and the mammoths became central to human survival and culture. For these Ice Age humans, woolly mammoths represented an enormous resource. A single mammoth provided not just meat, which could feed a community for weeks, but also hide for clothing and shelter, bones for tools and weapons, sinew for thread and binding, and fat for fuel and light. Archaeological sites across Europe and Siberia reveal the extent to which humans utilized mammoth resources. The remains of mammoth bone dwellings have been found, structures built from hundreds of individual bones, skulls, and long bones and ribs arranged to form frameworks that were then covered with hides. These dwellings, built in a landscape where wood was scarce, demonstrate remarkable ingenuity and the importance of mammoths to human survival. The question of whether humans actively hunted mammoths or primarily scavenged already dead animals has been debated by researchers for decades. Evidence exists for both behaviors. Some mammoth remains show clear signs of butchery, cut marks on bones where stone tools removed meat, percussion marks where bones were broken open to extract marrow. A few sites show evidence of what might be hunting, places where multiple mammoths died in circumstances that suggest human involvement. But hunting a healthy adult mammoth would have been incredibly dangerous, and many researchers believe that humans primarily took advantage of animals that had died from natural causes, or that they targeted younger, more vulnerable individuals. Regardless of whether hunting was common or occasional, there is no doubt that mammoths featured prominently in Ice Age human culture and art. The cave paintings of Europe, created tens of thousands of years ago, include numerous depictions of mammoths. These paintings, rendered in ochre and charcoal on cave walls deep underground, show mammoths in profile, capturing the distinctive shape of their heads, the curve of their tusks, the shagginess of their coats. The artists who created these images clearly observed mammoths closely, understanding their anatomy and behavior well enough to recreate them with remarkable accuracy. Small carvings of mammoths, created from mammoth ivory, bone, or stone, have been found at archaeological sites across Europe. These portable art objects sometimes show incredible detail, with individual hairs carved into the surface, capturing the texture of the mammoth's coat. The purpose of these carvings is unknown. They may have had spiritual significance, representing the mammoth as a sacred animal. They may have been teaching tools, used to pass knowledge about mammoths from one generation to the next. Or they may have simply been expressions of appreciation for these magnificent creatures that played such a central role in Ice Age life. As the Ice Age progressed and conditions became increasingly harsh during the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, woolly mammoths faced significant challenges. The climate was at its coldest, ice sheets were at their greatest extent, and the mammoth steppe was becoming more fragmented. But the mammoths persisted, adapted to these conditions as their ancestors had adapted to changing climates for millions of years. They continued to thrive in the cold grasslands of Siberia, Alaska, and parts of Europe, their populations numbering in the millions, their presence shaping the landscape around them. Then, beginning around 15,000 years ago, the climate began to change dramatically. The Earth was warming, entering a period known as the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. The great ice sheets that had covered so much of the northern hemisphere began to retreat, melting back toward the poles. Sea levels rose as water that had been locked up in ice returned to the oceans. The mammoth steppe, that vast grassland ecosystem that had supported such enormous populations of large herbivores, began to transform. In many areas, the cold, dry grasslands gave way to forests, to wetlands, to tundra that was wetter and less productive than the steppe had been. For species adapted to the open grasslands, these changes were catastrophic. The woolly mammoth populations began to decline. As their habitat shrank and became fragmented, the great herds that had once roamed across thousands of miles found themselves confined to smaller and smaller areas. The changing climate brought new challenges. Warmer temperatures meant that snowfall patterns changed, and in some regions, the snow became deeper and wetter, making it harder for mammoths to reach the vegetation beneath. The growing forests reduced the amount of grassland available for grazing. Species that had thrived in the open steppe found themselves in a landscape that no longer met their needs. By 10,000 years ago, woolly mammoths had disappeared from most of their former range. They were gone from Europe, from most of Siberia, from North America, except for a few isolated populations. The vast herds were no more, but the species was not yet extinct. On islands off the coast of Siberia and Alaska, small populations of mammoths survived, cut off from the mainland by rising sea levels. The most famous of these refugia was Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean north of Siberia. Here, a population of woolly mammoths continued to live, adapting to the limited resources of their island home, becoming somewhat smaller than their mainland ancestors. The mammoths of Wrangel Island survived for thousands of years after their mainland relatives had vanished. Generation after generation, these animals persisted, a last remnant of a once great species clinging to existence on a remote Arctic island. But they were living on borrowed time. The population was small, probably numbering only a few hundred individuals at most, and small populations face unique challenges. Genetic diversity decreases, making the population more vulnerable to disease and environmental changes. Inbreeding becomes unavoidable, potentially leading to genetic defects, and random chance plays a larger role in a small population, where a particularly harsh winter or an outbreak of disease can have devastating effects. Around 4,000 years ago, approximately 3,800 years before the present day, the last woolly mammoth died on Wrangel Island. The exact circumstances of that final extinction are unknown. Perhaps disease swept through the small population. Perhaps an especially severe environmental event, a harsh winter, or a series of poor summers, pushed the population beyond its ability to recover. Perhaps the accumulation of genetic problems in the small, isolated population finally took its toll. Whatever the specific cause, the result was the same. After millions of years of evolution, after hundreds of thousands of years as a distinct species, after surviving the worst that the Ice Age could throw at them, the woolly mammoth was gone. The timing of this final extinction is remarkable when you consider it in the context of human history. 4,000 years ago, The pyramids of Egypt had already been standing for centuries. The Minoan civilization was flourishing on Crete. The great cities of Mesopotamia bustled with activity. Humans had developed writing, complex social structures, advanced technology, and on a remote island in the Arctic, mammoths still walked, completely unaware that they were the last of their kind, that their species was counting down its final days. It is a strange and moving thought, this overlap between the ancient world of Ice Age megafauna and the beginnings of recorded human history. The extinction of the woolly mammoth, like the extinctions of so many other Ice Age giants, has been the subject of extensive scientific debate. Two main hypotheses have been proposed to explain why these animals vanished. The first is climate change, the transformation of their habitat as the world warmed and the mammoth steppe gave way to different ecosystems. The second is human hunting, the idea that humans, with their sophisticated weapons and hunting strategies, hunted mammoths and other megafauna to extinction. The truth, most scientists now believe, probably involves both factors working together, along with other elements that we are only beginning to understand. The climate change hypothesis is supported by clear evidence of dramatic environmental transformation. The fossil record shows that as the climate warmed, the plant communities changed, and the animals that depended on those plants either adapted, moved, or went extinct. Species that could adapt to forests or wetlands survived. Those that could only thrive in the cold, dry grasslands of the mammoth steppe disappeared. The timing of mammoth extinctions correlates broadly with the timing of environmental changes, suggesting a strong causal relationship. Computer models of mammoth habitat, taking into account temperature, precipitation, and vegetation type, show that suitable habitat for mammoths shrank dramatically during the period when the species was declining. However, climate change alone may not fully explain the pattern of extinctions. Other periods in Earth's history saw dramatic climate swings, yet Ice Age megafauna survived those changes. What was different about this particular warming period? One significant difference was the presence of humans, who by this time had spread across much of the globe and had developed increasingly sophisticated hunting technologies. Stone-tipped spears, atlatls to throw those spears with greater force, coordinated group hunting strategies, controlled use of fire to drive animals into kill zones. All of these represented a level of hunting efficiency that had not existed in previous warm periods. Evidence for human hunting of mammoths exists but is not overwhelming. Archaeological sites with mammoth remains and human artifacts occur throughout the former range of the species. Some mammoth bones bear marks from stone tools, clear evidence of butchery. A few sites suggest possible hunting, though these are rare and often debated. What is clear is that humans utilized mammoth resources extensively, whether through hunting or scavenging. The question is whether this utilization was significant enough to drive extinctions. In regions where humans arrived relatively late, such as North America, mammoth extinctions occurred relatively soon after human arrival, a pattern that some researchers see as evidence for hunting pressure. In regions where humans and mammoths had coexisted for tens of thousands of years, such as Europe and Siberia, the pattern is less clear. Recent research has introduced additional factors into the extinction debate. One hypothesis suggests that mammoths and other large herbivores actually helped maintain their grassland habitat through their feeding and trampling behavior, and that as their populations declined, regardless of the initial cause, the landscape changed in ways that made it even less suitable for them. This created a feedback loop where declining mammoth populations led to habitat degradation, which led to further population decline. Another hypothesis focuses on disease, suggesting that pathogens, possibly introduced by humans or by their domesticated animals, or simply emerging in stressed populations, could have played a role in the extinctions. The most likely scenario is that multiple factors worked together to drive woolly mammoths to extinction. Climate change altered their habitat, reducing the amount of suitable grassland available and fragmenting what remained. This stressed mammoth populations, making them more vulnerable. Human hunting, even if it was not intensive, added additional pressure, particularly if it targeted females or young animals, which would have had the greatest impact on population growth. Diseases, habitat feedbacks, and random chance events in small populations all contributed. The extinction was not caused by any single factor but by a complex interplay of environmental, biological, and potentially human influences. For thousands of years after their extinction, woolly mammoths were known only through fossils, and the stories passed down through human cultures. Indigenous peoples in Siberia, who occasionally found mammoth remains exposed by erosion or revealed by melting permafrost, developed legends to explain these enormous bones and tusks. Some stories describe the mammoths as giant underground creatures that died when they accidentally surfaced. European explorers and scientists who traveled to Siberia in later centuries encountered these mammoth remains and recognized them as belonging to extinct elephants, beginning to piece together the story of these Ice Age giants. The preservation of woolly mammoths in the frozen ground of Siberia and Alaska has provided scientists with unprecedented insights into these animals. Unlike most fossils, which consist only of mineralized bones, mammoth remains, found in permafrost, often include soft tissues, fur, even stomach contents. These exceptionally preserved specimens offer information that would be impossible to obtain from bones alone. The first complete mammoth frozen carcass was discovered in Siberia in 1879, though unfortunately much of it had begun to decay before scientists could study it properly. Since then, dozens of frozen mammoths have been found, each one adding to our understanding of these creatures. One of the most famous frozen mammoths is a baby female discovered in 2007 on the Yamal Peninsula in Siberia. Named Lyuba after the wife of the reindeer herder who found her, this infant mammoth died at approximately 1 month of age, about 42,000 years ago. Her body was so well preserved that her internal organs were intact, her trunk was undamaged, and even the milk in her stomach could be analyzed. The examination of Lyuba revealed details about mammoth growth and development that would have been impossible to learn any other way. Her teeth showed that she had been actively nursing. The contents of her digestive system included evidence that, like modern baby elephants, young mammoths ate their mother's dung, which helped establish the beneficial gut bacteria they needed to digest plant material. Another significant discovery occurred in 1999, when the Jarkov mammoth was found in the Taimyr Peninsula of Siberia. What made this find particularly exciting was that the mammoth was entombed in a massive block of frozen earth, which scientists hoped would preserve not just the mammoth itself, but also DNA and potentially living cells that could be used in cloning research. The entire block, weighing 23 tons, was carefully excavated and transported to an ice cave, where it has been slowly and painstakingly examined. While the mammoth itself turned out to be less well preserved than initially hoped, the surrounding sediments contained a treasure trove of information about the Ice Age environment. The study of mammoth DNA has revolutionized our understanding of these animals and their evolutionary history. The first mammoth DNA was extracted in 1994 from a specimen about 50,000 years old. Since then, scientists have sequenced complete mammoth genomes, comparing them to the genomes of modern elephants and other species. This genetic research has revealed that woolly mammoths were most closely related to Asian elephants, with the two species having diverged from a common ancestor around 6 million years ago. The mammoth genome shows genetic adaptations to cold environments, including genes involved in fat metabolism, hair growth, and temperature perception. The availability of mammoth DNA has raised the tantalizing possibility of bringing the species back from extinction through a process called de-extinction. Several research groups are working on this idea, using different approaches. One method involves editing the genome of an Asian elephant embryo to include mammoth genes that code for cold-adapted features like thick fur, small ears, and cold-tolerant hemoglobin. The goal would not be to recreate an exact woolly mammoth, which is probably impossible given the degradation of ancient DNA, but to create an elephant with mammoth traits, a hybrid sometimes called a mammophant. This creature could potentially survive in Arctic environments and might even help restore some of the ecosystem functions that were lost when mammoths went extinct. The idea of de-extinction is controversial, raising numerous ethical, ecological, and practical questions. Critics point out that we don't fully understand the consequences of introducing a mammoth-like creature into modern Arctic ecosystems. They note that the habitat mammoths once occupied no longer exists in the same form, and creating suitable habitat would be challenging. They question whether we have the right to bring back a species when we haven't adequately protected the species that currently exist. They worry about the welfare of any created animals, who would be growing up without parents of their own species to teach them how to be mammoths. And they ask whether the resources dedicated to de-extinction might be better spent on preserving endangered species that are still with us. Proponents of de-extinction argue that mammoths could play an important role in combating climate change in the Arctic. The mammoth steppe ecosystem, they suggest, was actually a carbon sink, storing carbon in the soil through the actions of the grazing animals. When mammoths and other large herbivores grazed, trampled, and fertilized the grasslands. They promoted the growth of grasses and prevented the expansion of trees. Grasslands, particularly in cold climates, can store significant amounts of carbon in their root systems and in the soil. Today, much of the Arctic is warming rapidly, and permafrost is melting, releasing massive amounts of methane and carbon dioxide. Perhaps, these researchers argue, reintroducing mammoth-like creatures could help restore the grassland ecosystem and slow the melting of permafrost. A project called Pleistocene Park in northeastern Siberia is already testing some of these ideas. Established by Russian scientist Sergei Zimov and his son Nikita, the park aims to recreate something resembling the mammoth steppe ecosystem by introducing large herbivores to the tundra. Horses, reindeer, bison, musk oxen, and other species have been brought to the area, and the researchers are monitoring how these animals affect the landscape. Initial results suggest that the animals do indeed promote the growth of grassland vegetation through their grazing and trampling. The presence of large herbivores in winter also compacts the snow, allowing more cold to penetrate the ground, which could help keep permafrost frozen. If mammoth-like creatures were successfully created, Pleistocene Park could provide a home for them. Beyond the scientific value and the ecological possibilities, there is something deeply moving about the idea of woolly mammoths, about these enormous, shaggy creatures that survived for so long in such harsh conditions and then vanished. They represent a lost world, a time when Earth was different, when ice and cold ruled vast territories, when different sets of species filled the landscape. They remind us that extinction is real, that species, even successful ones that persist for hundreds of thousands of years, can disappear. They show us that the world is always changing, that the configurations of species and ecosystems we see today are temporary, that what exists now will someday be gone and replaced by something else. When we look at woolly mammoths, we are looking at our own history as well. These animals were part of the world that shaped our ancestors, the world in which human cultures developed and evolved. The mammoths that our distant relatives saw were not exhibits in a museum or images on a screen, but living, breathing creatures, sharing the landscape, competing for resources, providing food and materials, inspiring art, and perhaps even spiritual reverence. To understand Ice Age humans, we must understand the animals they lived alongside. And no animal was more iconic or more important than the woolly mammoth. The frozen bodies emerging from the permafrost, the bones scattered across northern landscapes, the tusks carved by ancient artists, the DNA preserved in ancient remains, all of these pieces contribute to our growing understanding of woolly mammoths. With each new discovery, with each scientific study, we learn more about how these animals lived, how they evolved, how they interacted with their environment and with other species, including humans. We learn about their social structures, their communication, their diet, their reproduction. We learn about the challenges they faced and the adaptations that allowed them to meet those challenges, at least for a time. There is something humbling about the mammoth's story. Here was a species supremely adapted to its environment, enormously successful for hundreds of thousands of years, present across vast areas of the northern hemisphere in numbers that must have run into the millions. And yet, when conditions changed, when the climate warmed and the grasslands transformed and humans spread across the landscape, that success offered no guarantee of survival. Adaptation to one set of conditions can become a liability when those conditions change. The very traits that made mammoths so successful in the Ice Age world, their size, their slow reproduction, their specialization for cold grasslands, may have contributed to their vulnerability when that world disappeared. As we face our own environmental challenges today, as we grapple with rapid climate change and habitat loss, and extinctions occurring at rates not seen since the end of the age of dinosaurs, the story of the woolly mammoth feels particularly relevant. It reminds us that the Earth's climate and ecosystems have always been dynamic, that change is constant, but also that change can have profound consequences for the species that depend on stable conditions. It reminds us that humans have been influencing other species for a very long time, that our actions have consequences that extend beyond our immediate needs and desires. And it reminds us that once a species is gone, it is truly gone, that extinction is final. The quest to understand woolly mammoths continues in laboratories around the world, in Arctic excavations, where new frozen remains are discovered each year, in museums where bones and tusks tell their silent stories, in computer models that try to recreate the Ice Age world. Each researcher, each expedition, each analysis adds another piece to the puzzle. We know far more about woolly mammoths today than we did 50 years ago. and scientists 50 years from now will undoubtedly know even more than we do now. The mammoth story is still being written, still being discovered, still being understood. As night falls across the far northern lands where woolly mammoths once walked, the wind continues to blow across the tundra, just as it did thousands of years ago. The landscape has changed, the ice has retreated, the great grasslands have transformed, but the bones remain, preserved in the frozen ground, waiting to be discovered, waiting to reveal their secrets. Each bone, each tusk, each hair from a massive coat is a connection to that vanished world, a tangible link to creatures that once lived and breathed and walked this earth. The woolly mammoth is extinct, yes, but it is not forgotten. Through science, through art, through imagination, through the preserved remains emerging from the permafrost, the mammoth lives on in human knowledge and memory, a testament to the richness of life on our planet and the profound changes that life has undergone across deep time. In the end, perhaps what draws us to woolly mammoths is not just their impressive size or their distinctive appearance, or even their exotic appeal as Ice Age creatures. Perhaps it is the fact that they are close enough in time that we can almost touch them, almost imagine them, almost hear their footsteps across the frozen ground. They are not the impossibly distant dinosaurs or the alien creatures of the deep prehistoric past. They lived recently enough that human eyes saw them, human hands created images of them, human communities depended on them. They are part of our story, woven into the fabric of human history and prehistory, and in trying to understand them, in piecing together their biology and behavior and ultimate fate, we are also trying to understand ourselves, our place in the natural world, our impact on other species, and our responsibility to the life that shares this planet with us. The mammoth steppe is gone. The great herds that once migrated across it are no more. The particular configuration of climate and vegetation and animal species that characterized the Ice Age world has vanished, transformed into something completely different. But the knowledge of that world, the understanding of how it functioned and what made it possible, continues to grow. And with that knowledge comes insight, not just into the past, but into the present and future as well. The woolly mammoth's story is over, but its lessons continue to resonate, reminding us that the world is always changing, that species rise and fall, that adaptation and survival are never guaranteed, and that every creature that lives leaves its mark on the planet, shaping the world for those who come after. Thanks for watching. May the memory of these magnificent creatures inspire us to value and protect the living wonders that still walk, swim, and fly across this earth. Sleep well, and see you in the next one.